chapter 6 is over the importance of knife skills for the culinarian. The knife is the most commonly used. It's one of the most important tools that you are going to use um, as a professional. And for that reason, it's important. I mean, it's not important, it's imperative that you develop good knife skills. It is going to help you down the road when you are working in kitchens and being able to be a productive member of that kitchen brigade. First thing, of course, when we work with knives, we always want to make sure we're working safely. First, make sure you're using the correct knife for the task at hand. Don't use a paring knife to cut a watermelon. On the flip side, you don't need to use a big chef's knife to cut a little bitty radish. Make sure you're using the correct knife for the task that you need. Um, Make sure you're always cutting away from yourself. The momentum when you are cutting should always be down and away from yourself. Make sure you're using a clean cutting board. You don't want to cut on glass, marble, or metal. Those are going to dull your blades faster, and in case of metal, it can be potentially a physical contamination. You can get metal shavings in the food that you're cutting. So don't ever use a glass, marble, or metal as far as for cutting on. Always want to place that damp towel underneath the cutting board, keeps it from sliding around. Again, safety first. Make sure you're keeping your knife sharp. A dull blade is more dangerous than a sharp one because you're going to have to apply more pressure to it in order for it to do its job, which increases the risk of it slipping. When you're carrying that knife, you always want to hold it down parallel to your leg as you walk, making sure the spine of it is facing towards the front. If a knife happens to fall, let it drop. A falling knife has no handle because Murphy's Law states if you try to catch that knife when it falls, you will probably catch it by the blade and hurt yourself. Let that knife fall if it's going to fall. Also, never leave a knife in a sink of water, especially soapy water, because you can't see it. Anybody reaching into that sink could potentially hurt themselves because they're going to pick it up. And again, Murphy's Law, they'll pick it up by the blade. So never leave a knife unattended into a sink of water. Making sure you're always washing and storing your knives properly. Wash and dry your knives by hand. It's recommended not to use commercial dishwashers. For the time that it takes to clean a knife, it's just as easy in most cases to wash your knives by hand instead of taking the time to run it through a dish machine. Sharpening your knives can be done with the whetstone and a steel, and I will show you how to use both of those during your lab times. Couple of things though with sharpening, the optimal angle is about 20 degrees when you're working with either the whetstone or the steel. And so there's a cool visual here on the PowerPoint that gives you an idea. And then I'll reinforce that when I show you in the classroom, or in the kitchen, I should say, how to actually utilize the stone and that steel. But there's a good visual representation as far as the angle when making sure you're sharpening your blade correctly. Grip of the knife, we've talked about in the lab, but as a very, just as a reminder, you're holding it by the bolster. So you're holding it where the blade and the handle come together. Thumb on one side, pointer finger on the other, and then your other three fingers wrapped around the handle of the blade. This is going to give you the most control over that chef's knife. It takes a little getting used to. If you're used to working another way, it's again undeveloping habits or breaking old habits in some cases. But once you get this ingrained in your head, it'll become second nature to you. So some different suggestions when working with your knife. You can make sure that grip is comfortable getting it into position. Keep the sharp edge of the blade on the cutting board. Again, kind of a safety thing. We've talked about this in the lab, but just to reiterate, get that holding that item with your three fingertips and your thumb, that claw look when you're holding it. Again, something that if you're not used to, it's going to take a little bit, but it will hopefully become second nature to you. Using that second joint, using your index or your middle finger as the guide for you to have your blade up against, so you always know where the blade is at. Smooth, even strokes for slicing the food. And then again, just to reiterate, do not use that dull knife. It's going to be more dangerous than using a very sharp knife. some different cuts that you will run into with your knife. So some of these we've talked about, if not, we'll be talking about them soon. So the first one's a chiffonade. So a chiffonade is a finely shredded or sliced leafy vegetable. The most common of those are basil, or a good practice one is spinach because of the cost. I will show you how to do a chiffonade in the lab, and you will actually have opportunity to practice your own chiffonade during our knife skills classes. Rondelles or rounds, those are just disc-shaped slices. So it's just like taking that carrot and cutting it down so you got these little discs, again, but when you say rondelles, it sounds more fancy, sounds more expensive. We're doing rondelle of carrot as our side dish this evening instead of we're doing, round cuts of carrot. Just doesn't sound as fancy with it. The diagonals are similar to rondelles, but you're taking the cut at about a 45-degree angle, so you get an oval as opposed to a round cut. The oblique or the roll cuts, they look like two angled cut sides, and then lozenges are the diamond-shaped pieces, usually with firmer vegetables. Horizontal slicing means a couple different things. In meats, it means to butterfly or cut a pocket into a protein, a meat, poultry, or fish. The other thing you can do is it's great for thinly slicing soft vegetables or finishing off slicing soft vegetables like tomatoes. You can slice whole tomatoes, but once you get to the end, it makes sense to lay it down flat and cut it horizontally instead of trying to, weeble wobble on it and keeping it vertical, and then you accidentally, it slips and you end up cutting yourself. When you're doing a horizontal slicing, you're holding your knife parallel to that table, and then you either cut through the item completely or cut a pocket in desired depth. I'll show you as far as horizontal slicing with vegetables and fruits. When we get into meats, poultry, and fish, next 8 weeks, I'll show you how to cut those butterfly or those pockets for meat that you might be working with. Chopping. So people use the term chop and dice interchangeably. They technically are two different definitions. A chop is to cut something into pieces where we're not looking for exact uniformity. So as long as they're around the same size, we're good. So, if I ask you to chop some carrots, I'm not looking for a specific size. I might say medium chopped carrots. So I'm looking for around that 1/2 inch or so, which we'll talk about in a second. But it doesn't have to be exactly that size. And those are where, it's going to get strained out, or we're using it for a flavor profile. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be exactly the same, because chances are it's going to get pureed up or strained out. And so you're not going to see them anyway. And so that's chopping or chop. Just note that there's not a specific size or uniformity requirement. Now, when we're talking sticks and dices, it's a different story. There are 2 different stick cuts that you can cut here in the Classic Kitchen. The first is a bâtonnet. That's a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch by 2 inches long. And the second one is the julienne, which is an 1/8 inch by 1/8 inch by 2 inches long. You will be tested on those. In fact, those will come up on test number 1 and test number 2 as fill in the blank. It'll ask, what's the size of a bâtonnet? And you are going to need to write in 1/4 by 1/4 by 2 inches. You get the idea. So they are imperative that you do learn these, not just for test purposes, but because you will need to know the definitions of them while you're working professionally, and you're going to need to be able to cut those sizes, which is where the labs come in for practice. So you got your bâtonnet and your julienne. And then for your dice cuts, starting with the smallest is the brunoise, 1/8 by 1/8 by 1/8. Small dice, 1/4 by 1/4 by 1/4. Medium dice, 1/2 by 1/2 by 1/2. Large dice, 3/4 by 3/4 by 3/4. Those 4 as well, I will be testing you on. And not only will it be on written test, but also practically to show that you know how to make those cuts. So practice, practice, practice. The other dice cut there is a paysan. And a paysan is a 1/2 by 1/2 by 1/8. So it looks like a piece of tile. So it's a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch square, but it's only an 1/8 inch thick. So it's another variation. Instead of a cube cut, you're doing this paysan as a different style for maybe a soup or something along those lines. The term mincing. So mince means to cut an item into very small pieces, and you will find that the term minced and finely chopped are used interchangeably, and they do mean the same thing. So if something says finely chopped, they're meaning minced, all right, or vice versa. And again, I will show you how to do that in the lab. Oh, round cuts. So do the second one first, the Parisienne, the below right. Those are spheres of fruits or vegetables cut with a melon ball cutter. You've maybe done this when you were younger, doing a fruit salad, maybe making it with somebody in the family, and you got the melon baller and you're cutting out the cantaloupe and honeydew. You didn't realize you were doing Parisiennes, but again, fancy French term, right? But you can do these, as you can see, with potatoes, and you could do a Parisienne potato as a side dish as opposed to, a sliced or a diced type of potato. The top one is called a tournée. I know that's not what it looks like, but remember it's French. It's tournée. And it's a football-shaped piece with 7 equal sides and blunt ends. So you can see examples of those on the bottom left picture. They are typically done with root vegetables and with potatoes and such are probably the big ones. Potatoes and then other root veggies, you can do them. They definitely are a classic French product, and I want you to know them. I'm going to show you how to do them, but I'll tell you right now that I'm not testing you on them, because if you're looking how to spend your time for practicing, I want you to practice your stick and dice cuts. Those are much more important than learning how to do a tournée. If you decide that you want to work in classic French restaurants, yeah, you're probably going to see a tournée. Chances of you seeing a tournée here in Central Illinois is pretty slim. I'm not going to say no, you won't, because somebody will prove me wrong, but the chances are pretty low. That's why I would rather you practice it, but I want you to focus on those stick and dice cuts, because those are what you're going to be tested on. Then you do sometimes get into some specialty items. The spiral slicers is kind of a fun tool. Makes cuts that you couldn't do with a knife for doing haystacks or different looks like that. They're great for as they are, or breading and deep frying for garnishes, things along those lines. Mandolin is a non-mechanical cutting tool, so it's a adjustable slicer. Great for looking at speed cutting of products. Mandolin is not something that we're going to be using in this class, because I want you to practice your knives, but we do have them available in other classes, especially when you are looking at timed labs and you need to get the most bang for your buck. It might be smart for you to pull out one of the mandolins from dry storage and utilize that to help you with some of the cutting that might take you longer with the chef's knife or what have you. But it is a tool that's available, not for 150 students, but down the road you can. And that is the chapter. Hopefully you gained some information, and again, really, really important, because those stick and dice cuts especially, and that's where I said we're spending these first 3 weeks on when it comes to your knife skills and such. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next chapter.